Many of us are familiar with some of the amendments to the United States Constitution, especially the first 10 amendments, which are collectively known as the Bill of Rights. Now, there are a total of 27 amendments to the Constitution, beginning with the Bill of Rights, which were ratified in 1791, and most recently, the 27th Amendment, which was ratified in 1992. However, this newest amendment actually originated with the Bill of Rights all the way back in 1789, and its eventual ratification over 200 years later is very surprising and tells for a very interesting story. Hello everybody, my name is Adam, and this is the US History Unlocked podcast, where we look at historical events, people, places, and facts that relate to the United States. As always, if you ever have anything you'd like discussed on the show, you have an idea, feel free to leave a comment and we may look into it in a future episode. But today, let's look into the 27th Amendment to the Constitution and its unlikely passage and ratification. Now, many of us younger people have never experienced an amendment to the Constitution be ratified, and today it really seems unlikely that an amendment will be ratified given the requirements and the state of Congress. So an amendment needs 2/3 support of both the House and the Senate to be passed, and then it's sent to the states to be ratified, and 3/4 of the state legislatures or a state ratifying convention must ratify the amendment, and then it is then added to the Constitution. Now, the only amendment that was ratified by a state ratifying convention was the 21st Amendment, and that repealed the 18th Amendment, and this was done in 1933. A convention can also be called to propose amendments to the Constitution, but this has never happened. So anyways, there have been many amendments that have also garnered 2/3 support of the House and Senate. So then it was sent to the states to be ratified. However, not enough states ratified these amendments, so they were never added to the Constitution. And some of these unratified amendments had an expiration date attached to them. So if they weren't ratified within X number of years of being submitted to the states, they could no longer be ratified. We may look into these unratified amendments in a future episode because they are very interesting and they do have some ramifications if they were, in fact, ratified, but that is for a future discussion. Now, some Supreme Court cases that are relevant to today. First one, Dillon v. Glass from 1921. Here, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress may include an expiration date for amendments to be ratified. However, they also ruled that amendments without an expiration date must be ratified within a, quote, reasonable time after their proposal. They didn't specify exactly how many years after the proposal, just a reasonable amount of time. Later in 1939, the Supreme Court, they had another case, Coleman v. Miller. And here the court ruled that if an amendment was proposed to the states without an expiration date, it continually remained pending and it may still be ratified whenever. And this now brings us to the 27th Amendment to the Constitution and its story. This is the most recent amendment added to the Constitution, but it was one of the first amendments ever proposed. First off, what is the 27th Amendment? Well, it states, quote, "No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened," end quote. So Congress has always set their own salary. Whether you agree with that or not, it is interesting that they do that, but they've always set their own salary and for the president and other members of the government. And the 27th Amendment makes it so that if Congress passes a law which changes their own salary, the salary for representatives and senators, it won't take effect until after the next election. So for example, if Congress passed a law right now in August of 2025 to increase their own salary, the increase wouldn't take place until after the 2026 election and those members were sworn in and began their term in 2027. Like we said, the 27th Amendment was one of the first amendments proposed all the way back in 1789, along with the Bill of Rights. So some backstory on that. The Constitutional Convention took place in 1787. The states then had to ratify the Constitution. It wasn't until 1788 that the Constitution was ratified. And then the year after that, in 1789, the new government under the Constitution officially began. Now, during the Constitutional Convention and the state ratifying conventions for the Constitution, presidential salaries and congressional salaries were brought up, and they were a cause for concern for some people. During these state ratifying conventions, some states would ratify the Constitution as well as offering suggested amendments to the Constitution. Some people even proposed to hold another constitutional convention to rework the Constitution and add amendments, but this never happened and probably would not have been good if it did happen. So we have some states like New York, Virginia, and North Carolina. They ratify the Constitution, but they also suggest amendments, and some of these we find in the Bill of Rights. Not the exact language of the amendments, but the same ideas in the Bill of Rights. And these states sometimes also suggested an amendment like the 27th Amendment. Again, not the same exact language, but the same idea that changes to congressional salaries do not take effect until after the next election cycle. So we have the Constitution ratified in 1788, and then some states suggesting amendments to the Constitution. When the new government began in March of 1789, James Madison and the House began working on passing some amendments. Madison introduced the 27th Amendment and others that we find in the Bill of Rights in June of 1789. Interestingly, James Madison, he wanted amendments embedded into the text of the Constitution. We know amendments today, they're added to the end of the Constitution or added after the most recent amendment, but Madison actually wanted amendments embedded into the text of the Constitution. And this would really have caused other issues because not only do you have to debate whether or not this amendment should be added to the Constitution, you also have to debate where exactly it should have been added to the Constitution. Madison did push pretty hard to have the amendments added into the text of the Constitution, but he ultimately relented, and now we know the amendments are added after the Constitution. Throughout the summer, the House was working on passing amendments, and in August, they sent what is known as the Bill of Rights, the now 27th Amendment, and others to the Senate. And the Senate made alterations, and they ultimately cut the number of amendments down to 12. There was then a committee with members of the House and Senate to discuss these differences between the amendments from the House and Senate, and they eventually agreed on 12 amendments and the language of them, and these 12 amendments were submitted to the states for ratification in September of 1789. These 12 consisted of the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments, the now 27th Amendment, and what is known as the Congressional Apportionment Amendment, which is still unratified and could technically be ratified today. This Congressional Apportionment Amendment, it would have fixed the representative to population ratio to 1 representative for every 30,000 citizens, eventually raising it to 1 representative for every 50,000 citizens. This has only been ratified by 11 states, so today it would have to be ratified by 27 more states to bring it to the number of 38 states and be added to the Constitution. If it was ratified today, there would then be almost 2,000 representatives in the House, given the current U.S. population. So I'm not sure that this amendment will ever be ratified because the House has been restricted to 435 members for a while now, and I don't think that will change anytime soon. Also, interestingly, the Congressional Apportionment Amendment and the now 27th Amendment, they were listed before the Bill of Rights when they were submitted to the states, but they ultimately were not ratified along with the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in December of 1791. And only these 10 amendments were ratified because states would pick and choose what amendments they wanted to be ratified. So only the first 10 amendments got the required number of states to ratify, and the other 2 amendments did not, so they ultimately were not ratified. Through 1792, the now 27th Amendment was ratified by 7 states, and at that point, it needed to be ratified by 12 due to new states being added. So 1792 ratified by 7 states. In 1873, Ohio ratified the amendment due to really an opposition of a law dubbed the Salary Grab Act, where Congress, they raised their own salary, they raised the president's salary, and they raised the Supreme Court justice's salary, which that salary change was retroactive to the beginning of their term. And now under the 27th Amendment, that could not happen because, again, salary changes take effect after the next election cycle. So in 1873, we then have 8 states that ratified it, and over 100 years after that, in 1978, Wyoming ratifies the amendment. So in 1978, we have 9 states that ratified the now 27th Amendment. And we're now brought to the modern revival of the 27th Amendment and its subsequent ratification. The modern revival begins in 1982 with an undergrad student at the University of Texas at Austin named Gregory Watson. Watson had to write a paper for a political science course at the university, and it was in this paper that Watson argued the amendment could still be ratified since it never had an expiration date attached to it. Ironically, Watson received a C grade for the paper. I've never read the paper. I don't know if it's out there. It might have actually not been that great. Watson kind of alluded to the fact that, yeah, the paper wasn't that great, and he wasn't surprised that it got a C grade. But the grade, it's interesting considering what resulted from the paper. Watson, he was correct in his assessment that the amendment could still be ratified. Recall the Supreme Court cases we mentioned earlier, where they ruled that amendments without an expiration date, they never expire, so they can always be ratified. And the now 27th Amendment never had an expiration date attached to it, so it could always be ratified. After his paper, which he received the C grade from, Watson began a campaign to get the amendment ratified, and he would write to various state legislatures to vote and ratify the amendment. He started the campaign with $6,000 of his own money, which today is worth around $20,000. So he spent a good amount of money, which was his own money, to begin this campaign. Initially, Watson, he thought that only 6 states had ratified the amendment. However, 9 states had ratified it. He was unaware of Kentucky's ratification in 1792, Ohio's ratification in 1873, and Wyoming's ratification in 1978. Remember that this was before we had the internet, so it wasn't easy for people to figure out this information, especially ratification by some states with an obscure amendment. It wasn't easy to find that information. But he then discovered that Ohio and Wyoming had ratified the amendment, and he still wasn't aware that Kentucky ratified the amendment. So in 1982, he thinks that 8 states have ratified it, when in reality, 9 states have ratified it. And it actually wasn't until after the ratification that people figured out that Kentucky ratified the amendment all the way back in 1792. Maine was the first state to ratify the amendment due to his campaign. They did so in 1983. Throughout the decade, states began ratifying the amendment. And in the early 90s, on May 7th, 1992, Michigan was believed to be the 38th state to ratify the amendment, which officially certified it as the 27th Amendment to the United States Constitution. However, recall that Kentucky actually ratified the amendment in 1792, but that wasn't known until 1997. So Alabama was actually the 38th state to ratify the amendment on May 5th, 1992, over 200 years after it was proposed. In total, 46 states have ratified the 27th Amendment. Massachusetts, Mississippi, New York, and Pennsylvania have not ratified the amendment. North Carolina reaffirmed their ratification in 1989 after having previously ratified it in 1789. Kentucky, they reaffirmed their ratification in 1996, although they weren't aware until 1997 that they previously ratified it in 1792. And New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, they ratified the amendment after having rejected it in the late 1700s. So over 200 years after having rejected it, these 3 states ended up ratifying the amendment. And then finally, in 2016, Zach Elkins, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, changed Watson's grade from a C to an A+. However, the university didn't allow A+ grades. They only allowed a max of an A grade. I believe, however, that the grade remained an A+, and it remains the only A+ grade given out at the university, which I think is fitting given the paper and what it ultimately caused. Very significant that a paper ultimately caused an amendment to the Constitution to be ratified. So that's the story of the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. Again, the most recent amendment ratified, but one of the first amendments ever proposed. The passage was very unlikely given the long time of over 200 years from when it was proposed to when it was ultimately ratified in 1992. Also arising from an undergrad student's paper that initially received a grade of a C. Again, we're going to have future episodes on amendments, on unratified amendments, which could still be ratified, like the 27th Amendment, which provide for an interesting story and interesting ramifications if they were ratified. But that's all I got today on the 27th Amendment, a very interesting story on the last amendment added to the Constitution. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. Take care. I'll see you here again next episode.